So, well-known inside reporter Jason Schreier, he writes for Bloomberg. He wrote an article about Sony and its relationships with some of its smaller support studios. Now, one of its small support studios talked about how they didn't feel like they got the priority or the autonomy that they deserved versus a much bigger studio like a Naughty Dog. And I thought that was really interesting. And looking at the conversation later online, a lot of it turned into, well, should Sony focus on a more AAA strategy or a more indie focused strategy? And so there's a lot to talk about there. And one of the things I want to get into is I want to look back at Sony's strategy during the PS3 and PS4 eras and look at the PS3 and PS4 exclusive games, who the studios were that made them, and also what studios got cancelled as well. Because I think if you do that, you can see what Sony's strategy was back then and also what their strategy is going forward. Alright, if you like this video, make sure to click the like button and also to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. So the article talks about how one of Sony's teams, the Visual Arts Service Group, wanted to transition into making games themselves. They were predominantly a support group supporting other Sony projects as required. It was a group of about 30 developers from across various Sony studios that came together. The article says, but Sony never fully acknowledged the team's existence or gave them the funding and support needed to succeed in the highly competitive video game market. The studio never even got its own name, and the game they were working on, Sony decided to move that back to Naughty Dog rather than have the smaller studio create it. The article goes on to talk about Sony's Japan studio. Sony's focus on exclusive blockbusters has come at the expense of niche teams and studios within the PlayStation organization, leading to high turnover and less choice for players. Last week, Sony reorganized the development office in Japan, resulting in mass departures of people who worked on less well-known but acclaimed games such as Gravity Rush and Everybody's Golf. The company has informed developers that it no longer wants to produce smaller games that are only successful in Japan. The article also mentions that Sony Bend Studio, which recently released Days Gone, was also denied a sequel by Sony, and that some parts of the Sony Bend team were concerned they would get absorbed by Naughty Dog. But back to Sony's Visual Arts Service Group, the team was actually working on The Last of Us Remake before Sony decided that it needed extra staff on The Last of Us Part 2. The team obliged and sent staff to work there. When work was complete, staff from Naughty Dog started joining the project for The Last of Us Remake. As they had already worked on the first game, suddenly it gave Naughty Dog developers more weight in discussions, and soon it was Naughty Dog that was in charge of the game, not the Visual Arts Group. So there's a lot to unpack here, and let's talk about Sony's Visual Arts Service Group first, but it appears they wanted to grow and make their own games. I think part of it was that they picked the wrong project and it got handed back to the original developer, and we have to realize that in corporate structures such as a conglomerate like Sony, that there are hierarchies everywhere. While it would be every developer's dream to work on what they want, in reality only very few developers get to have full autonomy on their work. And this might be a bad analogy, but even in basketball, only one guy gets to shoot the ball, everybody else has to make sure he gets the shot off. That doesn't mean I'm defending Sony. It is obviously disappointing that smaller teams don't get the support it needs to be successful, and there's a lot of potential and upside for Sony to grow small teams and making names and giving them recognition. Look no further than studios like Bluepoint Games, who have handled quality ports such as Shadow of the Colossus and Demon's Souls in the past. There's also the sad news that there were many layoffs at Japan Studio, which was one of Sony's most prolific studios in previous generations. But with mobile having such a huge growth in Japan and consoles in general being on the decline, if you want to play a Japanese AAA game, it's gonna have to come from one of the other third-party studios like Square Enix or Capcom. There's still Gran Turismo if that's your thing. But that says a lot about how Sony sees itself right now. The fundamental philosophy seems to be console generations and console exclusives. To make these AAA games, the development is becoming increasingly demanding, more time consuming, which means more resources need to go into them. But the question is this about AAA versus indie games? If Sony is focusing only on AAA games, does that mean there'll be less opportunities for indie games and studios? To answer this question, I thought it'd be interesting to look at Sony studios during the PS3 and PS4 era, including both the ones that are thriving and ones that have closed down, and see if we can determine Sony's strategy going forward. If we take a look at this table, which details Sony studios that worked on PS3 exclusives, we see that there are studios that are still working on the same franchises, so Sony has been pretty careful with its core stable of games. Games like God of War, Gran Turismo, and Ratchet & Clank already have their PS5 entries confirmed. I think the more interesting information is the studios that are no longer here today. Studios like Zipper Interactive and Slant6 Games, who worked on SOCOM or Lightbox Interactive for Starhawk, or Studio Liverpool, who worked on Wipeout. By and large, games like Haze and Lair, which flopped terribly, ended up costing the studio, but I think it's fair to say that the list of games on the left were far more successful than on the right. That's not to say these studios weren't talented. They didn't quite make the mark for a variety of reasons, some to do with the quality of the game, or the market at the time, or perhaps Sony didn't see growth looking forward. And we have to remember, carrying a studio of hundreds of people for 3 to 4 years per game is a very long time with a huge budget. That said, from this list, I think SOCOM developers were probably the most hard done by. Zipper Interactive developed MAG on PS3, which you may recall stood for Massive Action Game, and could have been the first 100-player first-person shooter. It could have had ample knowledge to make a Battle Royale game, which have been so popular recently. On PS4, we see a different trend in terms of studios working on exclusive games. Firstly, many of the top-tier AAA developers continued to work on their existing franchises, while they were also given the freedom to add another franchise to Sony's stable of games. The PS4 introduced new franchises such as Ghost of Tsushima, Spider-Man, and Horizon Zero Dawn, but there simply weren't any A-level Sony games like they had on PS3. Most of them were not profitable from Sony's point of view, so Sony got rid of them. As you can see, there's quite a clear distinction between AAA games and smaller indie titles. But I don't think Sony ignored indie games or will going forward, which many commenters online were concerned about. What happened last generation was most of these smaller games were made by indie developers, some of which were funded by Sony as Sony exclusive games. They didn't make many smaller games themselves with their own studios for a number of reasons. One, it is just as easy to fund these games, and two, Sony's competitive advantage is in large AAA teams, and much smaller teams would mean they'd have to compete with other indie developers. As this table shows, most of these were second-party or even third-party developers that were paid to make exclusive games for Sony. And this is because when it comes to game development, it's a risky business where a game-breaking bug can arise 2 months before shipping, delaying the entire game. And this is the risk that Sony want to hand back to developers. So while Sony are trimming down their own studios, don't take this as the fact that they don't want any more indie games. There'll always be indie games, they just might not be made by Sony studios. One interesting thing to note is that there's also been less notable Sony studios that have closed down over the PS4 period compared to the PS3 period. Ultimately, Sony focusing on AAA titles is more about risk management than whether it wants to make AAA games or indie games. Sony is great at making AAA games, and that's where it's got its competitive advantage versus like a Square Enix, a Capcom, or a Microsoft. So that's where they should focus in. And I don't think people should be too worried about whether Sony will have indie games or smaller games, because Sony will go ahead and fund those games. They just don't want to manage them, that's all. And I think you'll still get titles like a Death Stranding or a Returnal, for example. And I think if Sony doesn't have to manage them and the indie developer actually manages themselves, then I think that works out a lot better for both Sony and also the developer and studio. Alright, that's going to be it for this one. If you like this video, make sure to click the like button, also to subscribe to this channel for more videos like this, and I'll see you in the next one.